Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, April 14th, 2023. National Rifle Association holds its annual meeting in Indianapolis with a dozen announced and possible Republican presidential candidates giving speeches supporting the Second Amendment. Just ahead, we'll hear from Asa Hutchinson, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Kristi, Noem, and Ron DeSantis. And we'll talk with the Hill's campaign's reporter, Caroline Vakil, about the NRA convention coming amid mass shootings and what younger voters think about the need for stricter gun laws. Suspect arrested in the Pentagon classified documents leak, Jack Teixeira, appears in federal court in Boston charged with retention and transmission of national defense information and willful retention of classified documents. That could land him in prison for a long time. He has pleaded not guilty, and he's being held until his next hearing next week. Justice Department announcing charges against over 20 leaders and members of a Mexican drug cartel run by the sons of the former drug kingpin El Chapo. It's centered on the trafficking of fentanyl to the U.S., which has led to the deaths of over 100,000 Americans just last year. President Joe Biden spending a final day in Ireland in County Mayo, where many of his ancestors lived 150 years ago before emigrating to the United States. North Korea says it has tested a new advanced version of an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, with solid fuel. We'll hear from the Deputy Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Jung Pak. And the Social Security Administration Chief Actuary, Stephen Goss, talks about the fiscal health of Social Security. And we start with a quick update about the abortion pill court case. This from the New York Times. Justice Samuel Alito issued a temporary stay on Friday, ensuring that a common abortion pill would remain widely available while the Supreme Court decides whether to grant a formal stay. The interim stay will expire at midnight on Wednesday. Such a stay is meant to preserve the status quo while the justices study the briefs and lower court rulings and did not forecast how the justices would ultimately rule. Justice Alito, a member of the court responsible for overseeing the appeals court, whose ruling is at issue, ordered the groups challenging the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the pill to file their briefs by Tuesday at noon. The move followed an emergency application filed Friday morning by the Biden administration asking the justices to intervene. That from the New York Times. And now to the NRA convention. A slew of 2024 GOP presidential hopefuls, writes CNN, traveling to Indianapolis on Friday for a National Rifle Association convention at which they courted gun rights activists in the wake of mass shootings in Kentucky and Tennessee in recent days. The NRA, the nation's foremost gun lobby, has seen its power wane in recent years amid leadership fights and legal battles. In 2021, the organization attempted to declare bankruptcy, an effort rejected by a federal judge. Still, the group is influential among conservatives, and its annual gatherings remain a magnet for presidential hopefuls. That from CNN. We'll start with the four declared Republican presidential candidates for 2024. Asa Hutchinson, former Arkansas governor; Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor; Vivek Ramaswamy, entrepreneur and author; and Donald Trump, former president. Here is Asa Hutchinson.
And now I am here before you as a candidate for President of the United States, and I guarantee you that I will continue to stand with the NRA. I will continue to stand for the Second Amendment and the fight that we have in front of us. But you know, we have some challenges that we face in America. There's the threat of violence in our cities, where urban mayors and chiefs of police are not doing their duty. My answer to the challenge of violence in our society are three simple words, and that is enforce the law. After the tragic murder of George Floyd, there were protests across America, many of those termed violent. Little Rock was no exception. And I witnessed the violence when I said our local law enforcement is not getting the job done. There was threats to people, there were burning buildings, and I said enough is enough. And I called the state police out, I called the National Guard out, and I said we're going to enforce the law. That night we arrested 70 violent criminals, and guess what happened? The violence stopped. You enforce the law. You enforce the law. I did that as United States Attorney, and we need to set that example across America.
Asa Hutchinson, Republican presidential candidate for 2024, former governor of Arkansas, at the NRA convention in Indianapolis today. A headline at WTHR TV in Indianapolis: "We're not anti-gun, we're anti-violence. Some Indianapolis businesses are going gun-free during the NRA convention. Several downtown Indianapolis businesses have put a sticker on their window to say they prefer people to not carry guns in their establishment." Another speaker today at the NRA meeting, Vivek Ramaswamy, businessman, author, and candidate for the Republican nomination for president.
When you have an agency like that FBI that told Martin Luther King he couldn't have that concealed permit, that now tells conservatives effectively the same thing, politicizing the police state against them, you can't reform that from the top down. That is why I've said what you're not supposed to say, but I'm saying it tonight. I will say it again. We will shut down the FBI and replace it with a police apparatus that actually respects the law instead of making it up. And that apparatus can actually do the job of those background checks, which means that tonight I'm pleased to make the announcement that if I'm elected next president of the United States, we will finally shut down the ATF, an agency that is beyond repair. That is the right answer left in the country. And while we're at it, let's make constitutional carry the law of the land and finally put any ban on those efforts to actually make that federal gun registry, because they want to be able to find you just like the British monarch wanted to find the colonists. We're not going to let that happen.
Vivek Ramaswamy, Republican candidate for president at the NRA convention in Indianapolis. Some of the speakers today could not be there in person, so they sent videos, including Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Trump.
Hi, it's Nikki Haley coming to you from Iowa. I am sorry I'm not there with you. Later this week when you are meeting, I will be at my daughter's wedding. So excuse me for not being there, as it's a happy time for our family. The NRA has been a great partner for a long time. When I was governor, we worked together as I expanded the Castle Doctrine. We backed constitutional carry. We did reciprocity with my sister state, Georgia, and so much more. I am a concealed weapons permit holder myself. My husband is a hunter, and we value the fact that citizens have the right to protect themselves. And so know that you've always got a friend in me, you've always got a partner in me as they try and take away any of our constitutional rights. But I want to thank you for meeting together, and I want to thank you for always fighting the good fight, and I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless.
Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor and U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, now running for president as a Republican. The website NRAAM for annual meeting.org has this: the NRA annual meetings and exhibits offers manufacturers, retailers, and outfitters a tremendous opportunity to sell merchandise, secure leads, book trips, and interact with the heart of the shooting sports community, consistently attracting upwards of 80,000 Second Amendment supporters and NRA members. This is the premier event to establish a profitable relationship with current and new customers. The Indiana Convention Center is located in downtown Indianapolis, and it offers plenty of space to ensure the 152nd NRA annual meetings and exhibits is one of the biggest celebrations of freedom on the planet. That from the NRA annual meeting website. Former President Donald Trump, who is running again for president, running for the Republican nomination first, also speaking today at the annual meeting.
As we restore safety to our streets, we must also restore it to our schools, hardening places of learning. We have to harden our assets to protect our children against threats of any kind. Last month, our hearts were shattered by news of the monstrous attack on a Christian elementary school in Nashville that claimed the lives of 3 adults and 3 precious children. Today, we wrap those beautiful families in our love, and we lift them up in our prayers. We also salute the law enforcement heroes who ran into danger and took out that killer with speed and skill that made us all very, very proud. That made us all very, very proud. It's a scandal and a tragedy that year after year Democrats in Washington continue to hold common sense school safety measures hostage to their radical gun control agenda, which in virtually all cases would do nothing to prevent attacks by demented and disturbed individuals, of which we have many, and many are coming into our country, but we're getting them out. Our country has been chock full of guns for centuries, and there was no talk of massacres of school children until around the year 2000. That's when it really started. They started talking about it. This is not a gun problem. This is a mental health problem. This is a social problem. This is a cultural problem. This is a spiritual problem. Each and every one of these heinous attacks depend on the same cold-blooded calculation that the evil monster will have a window of time to act out their demonic fantasy unchallenged. They want to be unchallenged. They don't want challenge. The only way to stop these wicked acts is to ensure that any sicko who would shoot up a school knows that within seconds, not minutes, they will face certain death. They have to know that. And they won't be doing it. For this reason, I will ask Congress to repeal totally ineffective legislation that makes it harder to protect our schools and easier for criminals to face absolutely no opposition when they go in. I will also create a new tax credit to reimburse any teacher for the full cost of a concealed carry firearm and training from highly qualified experts. Who's better? Who's better? If even 5% of teachers, people that are skilled with arms, we want that, 5% were voluntarily armed and trained to stop active shooters, we would achieve effective deterrence and the problem would cease to exist. And that would be a lot of people. But these are all people that are trained and talented with firearms. For about $12 billion, we could fund armed security guards at the entrance to every school in America and also arm every willing teacher. We want to arm some of these teachers. They have to go through rigorous, or as some people say, vigorous. I like vigorous better. I don't like rigorous. They have to go through vigorous training, but they were already there. And they'll do better than anybody you could put in, and they love our children. They really love our children. If we can send $120 billion to Ukraine, then we can afford 1/10 of that amount to protect American children in American schools.
Former president and now Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump at the NRA convention in Indianapolis today. Associated Press writing about the timing of the convention coming soon after the mass shootings in Tennessee and Kentucky. It illustrates, AP writes, the stark reality that such shootings have become enough of the fabric of American life that the NRA can no longer schedule around them, nor does it really want to. The convention falls on the second anniversary of the mass shooting at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis that killed 9 people. Former President Mike Pence telling Fox News this morning that he will decide whether to run for president soon. He said, "I believe that you'll have a clear idea of what the Pences decide in weeks and not months, and I promise to keep you informed of our decision." And later in the day, he spoke at the NRA convention, again saying that he will always advocate for gun rights.
We gather today at this NRA-ILA Leadership Forum in a very challenging time in our nation. In the wake of tragic violence that struck here in the heartland in recent days, at a Christian school in Nashville, Tennessee, and at a bank branch in Louisville, Kentucky. The Bible says that we mourn with those who mourn and grieve with those who grieve. And I know I speak with everyone here when I say that our hearts and our prayers are with all the families that suffered loss and injury in these unspeakable attacks. Ignoring the motivations of the trans activists who killed 3 children and 3 adults at that Christian school in Nashville, and ignoring the mental health challenges of the man who killed 5 people and injured 8 others in Louisville, President Biden and the Democrats have returned to the same tired arguments about gun control and gun confiscation. But we don't need gun control. We need crime control. We don't need lectures about the liberties of law-abiding citizens. We need solutions to protect our kids. So I say to Joe Biden and the gun control extremists, give up your pipe dreams of gun confiscation in this free society. Stop endangering our lives with gun bans and stop trampling on the God-given rights of the American people every time tragedy happens. Instead, you could actually join us in doing things that would bring real solutions and enhance safety to America's families. You could take steps to end violent crime in our major cities. You could confront the scourge of mental health in this country that's claiming lives every year.
Former Vice President Mike Pence at the NRA convention in Indianapolis. Mike Pence has yet to decide if he will run for president in 2024. Same with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican who spoke to the NRA today via video.
Now, there are some today who see the Second Amendment as an outdated remnant of a bygone era, but the capacity of the people to defend themselves is the basis of their ability to rule themselves. It is no coincidence that throughout history, one of the first things that authoritarian regimes have sought to do is to disarm their own citizens. I find it curious that the same people who advocate the defunding of law enforcement tend to be the same people who express hostility for individual gun rights. They want criminals to have the upper hand over law-abiding citizens. As governor, I've resisted calls to take up gun control, even when such a stand is superficially unpopular, because I understand that it is precisely at those moments when a right is unpopular that it needs true champions. Like we do with other issues in Florida, we've gone on offense to expand individual gun rights. I called on the legislature to expand Floridians' ability to protect themselves, their families, and all they hold dear, and we delivered. Earlier this month, I signed into law constitutional carry legislation that will bring Florida into line with 25 other states that recognize the fundamental right of law-abiding American citizens to keep and bear arms without a government-issued permission slip. Because of our efforts in Florida, we now have a majority of states in this country that recognize such a right. Now, your efforts in Tallahassee and in state capitals across the country paved the way for us to get this legislation across the finish line.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in a video to the NRA convention in Indianapolis. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, Republican as well, and also not saying one way or the other whether she will run for president in 2024, spoke in person at the NRA convention. At the end of her remarks, she called up the NRA Executive Vice President and CEO Wayne LaPierre as she signed an executive order.
Today I will sign an executive order to protect the God-given right to keep and bear arms from being infringed upon by financial institutions. My executive order, effective immediately, blocks state agencies from contracting with large banks that discriminate against firearm-related industries. Wayne, in 1787, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Madison, and he talked about how committed he was to freedom. He made this point in Latin, but it translates as, "I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery." Today with this I'm not sure, do you have a microphone, Wayne?
I don't.
You don't? I get to put words into your mouth then.
There you go. You're doing great.
Wayne is extremely grateful to me for doing this for the NRA today.
South Carolina Republican Governor Kristi Noem at the NRA convention in Indianapolis. Other potential 2024 Republican presidential candidates who spoke today were Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire. A closer look now at the Republican presidential candidate speaker lineup, both announced candidates and potential ones at the NRA convention in Indianapolis. Joining us on the phone is Caroline Vakil, campaigns reporter for The Hill. Thanks for being with us. In your article at thehill.com, you write that gun rights is an issue that plays well amongst the GOP base, but That puts them, the candidates, at a crossroads with another crucial voting bloc, Gen Z and millennial voters. What do the polling numbers say?
Well, thanks for having me. So you're right. Polling shows that younger voters, particularly Gen Z and millennials, are in favor of some stricter gun laws. There was a YouGov social change monitor that was released last month, and it even showed a little bit of a differential between younger Republicans, for example, and older Republicans. It showed that among Republicans who were Gen X, boomers, or from the silent generation, 23% of that cohort of Republicans believe that gun laws should be more restrictive than they are today. But when you ask Republicans who are, Gen Z or millennials, that percentage increases to 39%. And so even though both of those percentages are well under 50%, it does show there is a little bit of a disconnect generationally between how different voting blocs within the Republican Party are thinking about things like gun laws. And so, of course, these candidates are not focused on a general election with a general electorate right now. They're focused on trying to just, prevail in their primary, which hasn't even completely unfolded yet. But we can see in the backdrop that this is something they're going to have to be thinking about going forward post-primary.
These candidates are running against each other. Are there any differences between them, just in general, when it comes to gun rights, different levels?
I don't think we're going to be hearing any articulation of any differences between the candidates at this NRA convention. I mean, I think that this event for sure is going to just be highlighting their support for the Second Amendment. And if there are differences between the candidates, it's not going to necessarily be on display. It is one of those tricky issues because, again, sort of going back to what you had noted previously, Republican electorate, there is going to be some divergence in views, of course, among any voting bloc on whether or not Republicans or the general electorate at large favors restrictions. And it's clear that there are likely Republicans, for example, who maybe favor some sort of restrictions, though maybe by a smaller differential than, among Democrats or independents. But at these kind of events, that's not really going to be on display, and it's going to be a bit harder right now since the focus is going to be so much on just trying to win support among that key base of voters. And, of course, in primaries, a lot of candidates in this case are running toward their base, and they're going to have to backpedal or sort of moderate their position once the primary is over. So whether those differences are on display will remain to be seen, but unlikely if that's the case, at least showcased at the NRA convention.
We're talking with Caroline Vakil from The Hill. How powerful is the NRA now when it comes to elections?
I think that's a great question. I think amongst some of the Republican strategists I've spoken to, there is a little bit of a disagreement about how important the NRA is in today's Republican politics. I think one clue, though, is that it is still a powerful organization. It is a prominent gun lobbying group, just for the sole fact that we are seeing faces like former President Trump who are going to be at this convention in person, or if it's virtual, amongst other contenders presumed and announced alike who will be making those kind of appearances at this convention. So it is that in itself does show that it's still a bit of a powerhouse. But some Republicans I've spoken to have suggested that kind of influence has waned over the years. And amid some of the controversies that the group that has enmeshed the group in recent years. At the same time, one thing that is kind of interesting to note, though, about the NRA is that the NRA has ratings that it gives lawmakers, for example. Those are still somewhat important among Republican senators, sort of seen as a little bit of a litmus test regarding whether or not they are truly conservative, truly an advocate for gun rights. And so those ratings will still hold sway in certain elections. So there's still, I think, lingering elements that still show that the NRA is still a force within Republican politics. So I think it's changed a bit over the years more recently.
Caroline Vakil covers campaigns for The Hill. Her stories can be found at thehill.com and on Twitter at Caroline Vakil. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
The chair of the Democratic National Committee, Jamie Harrison, held an online briefing on Thursday talking about the NRA convention today, and he focused on the Republican presidential field, the announced candidates, and the potential ones.
We have seen how these horrific mass shootings have impacted the country, and still at this point, Republicans are committed to their annual pilgrimage to the NRA convention tomorrow. And it's just, it's shameless. It betrays your any sense of ideal that folks would see what's going on in this country and want to try to do something, but they say that they are powerless to do anything because all of their power is with the NRA. As a father, the fear of sending your kids to school and not knowing if they'll return home is terrifying, and it's a reality for far too many families. I was talking with another parent the other day, and I said, when I was in school, we had fire drills and tornado drills and drills for everything that was natural, right? Things that we could not control. Never did we have a gunman is on the campus for. But that is the reality that our kids face, that my kids face each and every day. And it should not be that way. It's not that way in any other country but this nation. It's time for our leaders to step up. It is time for them to step up. And I applaud Senator Murphy for what he does each and every day, and he does it straight out of his heart. So, this is about extremism, folks. It's about MAGA extremism. Donald Trump has said that there was no bigger fan of the NRA than him. And cravenly, he came to the NRA in the wake of the horrific Parkland shooting, where 17 children and teachers were gunned down. Trump's speech at the NRA this year is a vivid reminder to all of us of his appearance just last year, when he shamelessly spoke at the NRA convention just days after the tragic school shooting in Uvalde. And in the aftermath of the shootings in Nashville and Louisville, his appearance this year is equally indefensible. And folks, you can be sure that Republicans' extreme records on guns will be on full display tomorrow as they attempt to out-MAGA each other to capture the 2024 GOP nomination.
Democratic National Committee Chair Jamie Harrison, an online briefing on Thursday talking about the NRA convention today and the Republican presidential candidates and potential candidates who spoke. Washington Today continues in a moment.
There are a lot of places to get political information, but only at C-SPAN do you get it straight from the source. No matter where you are from or where you stand on the issues, C-SPAN is America's network. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. If it happens here, or here, or here, or anywhere that matters, America is watching on C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcast and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A story from Fox News. Jack Teixeira, the 21-year-old Massachusetts Air National Guardsman accused of leaking documents that the Defense Department says contains sensitive and highly classified material, has been charged Friday with unauthorized retention and transmission of national defense information and willful retention of classified documents. Wearing handcuffs and khaki prison jumpsuit, Jack Teixeira was read the charges shortly after 10 a.m. local time during an appearance in federal court in Boston. He did not enter a plea and was ordered detained pending a detention hearing set for Wednesday, April 19th, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. His father shouted during the hearing, "I love you, Jack." He responded, "I love you, Dad." That from Fox News. In Washington, D.C., a reporter asking U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland about this case.
On this leaks case that we're all talking about, I know you probably can't comment on the details, but as a senior national security official in the government, are you concerned that the U.S. national security apparatus does not have a handle and is not properly monitoring the 1.3 million Americans who have top secret security clearance.
I'd really just point you at what the Secretary of Defense has said, that the Department of Defense is leading an important effort now to evaluate and review the national security implications, and most important, to conduct a review of the methods of access, accountability, and control procedures that the department has, so that something like this can never happen again.
Attorney General Merrick Garland taking some questions at the Justice Department today. The criminal charges against Jack Teixeira come under the 1917 Espionage Act, and the two charges carry a maximum prison sentence of 15 years. President Biden putting out a written statement. I commend the rapid action taken by law enforcement to investigate and respond to the recent dissemination of classified U.S. government documents. While we are still determining the validity of those documents, I have directed our military and intelligence community to take steps to further secure and limit distribution of sensitive information, and our national security team is closely coordinating with our partners and allies. Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas, is a member of the Intelligence Committee. He spoke on Bloomberg Television Thursday night about Congress's role in investigating what happened.
There's an all-member briefing that's been scheduled for early next week, a classified briefing, but I suspect we'll have a much more detailed one in the House Intelligence Committee, and that will give us some parameters around conducting this oversight investigation of just why this 21-year-old Air National Guardsman had access to this level of data and why he felt compelled to break the law and become a spy.
So what needs to happen next year? I presume that hearings are going to follow, Congressman, but there's a lot of concern about what else might be out there. It's been referred to as the tip of the iceberg. How much of a problem does the Pentagon, does the government have when it comes to protecting the nation's secrets? How much more is out there, Congressman?
Well, Joe, in your panel, you discussed very logically, let's assess what was leaked. Let's assess the accuracy of it as it was posted. Let's see if it was interfered with. All those are, as noted by your journalist, excellent questions. I agree. That's something that we'll certainly focus on in our investigation. But it begs the question that we've already dealt with this year, which is the handling of classified information. Who has it? Who's eligible to have it? Who has a need to know? How is it stored? And what is the training in and around it? All these are such important questions, as we've already discussed from time to time this year as it relates to documents held by former presidents and vice presidents.
Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas, Intelligence Committee member, Thursday night on Bloomberg Television. A story in the Washington Post: the war in Ukraine has gutted Russia's clandestine Spetsnaz forces, and it will take Moscow years to rebuild them, according to classified U.S. assessments obtained by the Washington Post. The finding, which has not been previously reported, is among a cache of sensitive materials leaked online through the messaging platform Discord. U.S. officials attributed their assessments to Russian commanders' over-reliance on the specialized units which have been put to use as part of the frontline infantry formations. Those formations, like the Ukrainians, have suffered massive numbers of dead and wounded. That from the Washington Post. Back to the Justice Department, the Attorney General Merrick Garland was there primarily for an announcement on a different issue: charges against more than 24 members of the Mexican Sinaloa drug cartel's Chapitos network, including sons of the now jailed former drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. That's where the network gets its name. Also charged, 4 Chinese nationals for allegedly being part of providing the Mexican cartel with precursor chemicals to make fentanyl. U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration Administrator Ann Milgram, also at today's news conference.
The Chapitos control this global criminal enterprise, and they use ruthless violence to protect it. Indeed, death and destruction are central to their whole operation. To dominate the fentanyl supply chain, the Chapitos kill, kidnap, and torture anyone who gets in the way. In Mexico, they fed their enemies alive to tigers, electrocuted them, waterboarded them, and shot them at close range with a .50 caliber machine gun. To drive addiction, the Chapitos hide fentanyl in pills that look like oxycodone, Xanax, or Percocet. They mix fentanyl in with cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, all to induce Americans to take fentanyl without knowing it and to get hooked on it. Every day, we at DEA hear devastating stories of Americans who took a pill thinking it was a legitimate prescription medication, not knowing that there was fentanyl inside, and they died. And we are working tirelessly with the families who have lost loved ones to raise awareness, because many Americans don't know about the dangers of fentanyl. But the Chapitos know. They know their product is deadly. These are people who gave fentanyl to a man, watched him die, and then sent that same batch of fentanyl to the United States. They know that they are poisoning and killing Americans. They just don't care because they make billions of dollars doing it. Their greed is shocking and without bounds. Today's indictments strike a blow against the Chapitos and the global network they operate, a network that fuels violence and death on both sides of the border. 7 members of that network have now been arrested pursuant to our investigation in Colombia, Greece, Guatemala, and in the United States. Ovidio was arrested earlier this year by military officials in Mexico.
The DEA Administrator Ann Milgram at today's Justice Department news conference, U.S. government offering rewards for the others who have been charged and are not yet in custody. CBS News reports the synthetic opioid fentanyl is more than 50 times more potent than heroin. It's the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 49. In 2022, the DEA seized enough fentanyl to kill every American, more than 50 million fentanyl-laced pills and over 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. A story from Reuters: North Korea announced on Friday it had tested a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, a development set to radically promote its forces, which experts said would facilitate missile launches with little warning. Leader Kim Jong-un guided Thursday's test and warned it would make enemies experience a clear security crisis and constantly strike extreme uneasiness and horror into them by taking fatal and offensive counter-actions until they abandon their senseless thinking and reckless acts, North Korean state media said. Some reaction today from Jung Pak, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs.
Over the course of the 10 years that Kim has been in power, 10 plus years that Kim Jong-un has been in power, his weapon systems have become much more sophisticated and diverse and dangerous. And, you know, I think over the years, I think there have been lots of ways or lots of approaches that have been taken. One is, of course, and we continue to strengthen this, is sanctions implementation. There used to be much greater array of trading partners, but also proliferation partners, and it's because of sanctions and their implementation that those numbers have shrunk quite a bit. You know, we saw in the previous administration that we saw a great deal of engagement. But I think at the end of the day, only Kim Jong-un can decide to do what's best for his people. And it seems that he's decided that what's best for his people, and probably just for himself maybe, is the pursuit of nuclear weapons. We've mentioned in this session about how the pandemic has probably exacerbated health conditions and living conditions there, that the border has been pretty shut tight, and aid workers have, for the most part, all left the country. So that is 3 years of children without vaccinations, people without the required vaccinations and the required aid. And so, you know, we would encourage the DPRK to come to negotiations. The president, on downward, we've all been very clear that we want dialogue without any preconditions, and that, but it's really up to Kim Jong-un and the DPRK to decide when and how they're going to open up their borders. I would also argue that there has been greater international consensus on this issue, and that Beijing and Moscow can absolutely do more on sanctions implementation, and to press the DPRK to come to the table. Of course, we'll continue to evaluate our approach and take our next steps in lockstep with Korea and Japan, as well as other like-minded partners, and to try to encourage Kim Jong-un to come to dialogue. Negotiation and dialogue is really the only way that we're going to resolve this issue, and we hope that the DPRK opens up its borders soon.
Jung Pak is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Today at the Brookings Institution, panel discussion looking at the 70th anniversary of U.S.-South Korea being allies. The Chinese foreign minister today announcing that China will not sell weapons to either Russia or Ukraine to use in the war between the two. Qin Gang saying at a press conference in Germany with his German counterpart regarding the export of military items, China adopts a prudent and responsible attitude. China will not provide weapons to relevant parties of the conflict and manage and control the exports of dual-use items in accordance with laws and regulations. Associated Press reporting on this writes, China has maintained that it is neutral in the conflict while backing Russia politically, rhetorically, and economically at a time when Western nations have imposed punishing sanctions and sought to isolate Moscow for its invasion of its neighbor. President Joe Biden spending his final day in Ireland, seeing the sights in County Mayo in the western part of the country where his ancestors lived. BBC News reports the president had a chance encounter in Mayo with the priest who performed the last rites on his son, Beau, who died from brain cancer in 2015. President Biden talking about this at the St. Murdoch's Cathedral in the town of Ballina.
All year, the words of the great Mayo poet Andrew Rafferty have been ringing in my head. And it goes like this. He said, "Now the spring is coming. I shall raise my sail. Since it entered my head, I won't stay still until I shall stand in the center of County Mayo." I mean it. I had to be here. My son Hunter and my sister Valerie and I made several stops across Mayo today. We visited Knox Shrine, where I was hosted by Father Richard Gibbons. We also met, out of the blue, we didn't know he was there, a former military chaplain, Father O'Grady, who gave my son last rites in Walter Reed Medical Hospital in Washington. It was incredible to see him. It seemed like a sign. We traveled up to North Mayo Heritage Center, where I learned even more about my roots in Mayo. Roots that led me back here to Ballina and to St. Murdoch's. What a magnificent cathedral. I also learned, if you go far enough back, you can find a record of one Edward Blewett, who worked for several years in the Ordnance Survey mapping this entire area of Ireland. But even before that, it turns out, he worked in the old Ballina brickyard. We found a record, or I should say the Historical Society found a record for me. In 1828, he was paid 21 pounds and 12 shillings to help supply the bricks for this cathedral. 27,000 of them. I was able to hold one in my hand today. They're damn heavy. They're heavy. As he labored, I'm sure Edward imagined that one day his family would worship here, that his children would be baptized here like his son Patrick was, and that future generations of his family would mark the milestones of their lives here in these sturdy walls. But I doubt he ever imagined that his great-great-great-grandson would return 200 years later as President of the United States of America. Isn't that amazing?
President Biden in Ireland, his last stop, final day of his 4-day trip, both to the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 143, NASDAQ down 42, S&P down 8. Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, tweeting today about Social Security. President Biden and former President Trump have the same plan: do nothing and subject all Americans to cuts. the consequences of leaving Social Security without any changes, as promised by Biden-Trump, are dire. In 9 years, there will be an automatic 24% cut to Social Security. He is referring to the recent report from the Board of Trustees for Social Security and Medicare trust funds that estimates Social Security will no longer be able to make full retirement payments starting in 2033 unless there are changes in law to the funding and outlays. The Social Security Chief Actuary, Stephen Goss, talked about this today at an event hosted by the American Enterprise Institute.
What really happened in this year's trustees report? The main thing is the trustees did a reassessment of their view of the future economy and relative to where the economy was projected to be back in 2020, really before the recession. And essentially it was projected to be in the same place in the 2022 trustees report. The trustees reassessed and decided that they think that GDP in this year, 2023, will slow a bit. And that we will then thereafter be at about a 3% lower level of GDP for all years throughout the projection period. And this does have an effect on the long-term projections for Social Security, as we see on the next slide. So the next slide, you can see, as Andrew already hinted, this year the projected reserve depletion, and by the way, that does not mean running out of money, because as Andrew indicated, we would still have about 80% of the revenue needed in the year 2034 for the combined OESI and DI funds to be able to provide the benefits at that point. Now, why did it drop? Every year, the actuarial balance changes a little bit because we have the 75-year period changing, but the primary reason is what I just mentioned, the trustees' reassessment of the level of GDP in the future. That accounts for basically the rest of the drop in the actuarial balance for this year and creates annual deficits being a little bit larger throughout all the years through 2097. Now, of perhaps even more focus is the OESI separate fund, which is projected to have its reserves become depleted in 2033. That's also 1 year earlier in last year's report for really the same reason. Now, there's a little bit of good news here. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund reserves are projected to be solid throughout the 75-year period and beyond. In fact, even in slightly better shape this year, largely because disability applications and benefit awards have been lower again in 2022 than had been expected.
Social Security Administration Chief Actuary Stephen Goss today at a virtual program hosted by the American Enterprise Institute. A group of House members called the Main Street Republicans are advocating for including in a bill that will increase the national debt limit and also, according to the House Republican agenda, cap discretionary government spending, a provision to create a bipartisan commission to develop a plan to ensure the long-term solvency of Social Security and Medicare. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.